As you know, unfortunately, in November 2010 there was the disastrous explosion at the Pike River mine, and not long thereafter the 29 were believed, or were killed in a subsequent explosion, and they were all believed to be some quite significant distance from the entrance to the mine. And what then happened is that John Key did apologise in person to the families of the Pike River disaster, and a whole set of reforms were put in train. And in December 2010 there was the Commission of Inquiry, and then we got the Royal Commission report. From that there was a Workplace Health and Safety Task Force established, and then they released their report indicating that our current Health and Safety and Employment Act, which is a 1992 piece of legislation, is no longer fit for purpose. In August last year the government announced a major reform of health and safety in New Zealand, and in December last year WorkSafe New Zealand was established. And flowing on from that, we've got the Health and Safety Bill, which was introduced into Parliament. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And the intention is that come April next year the legislation will be passed, and thereafter supporting regulations will be developed. With the recent election, obviously this is a bill that was sponsored by the previous government, and with the election and National getting back into power, this is legislation that will continue to have strong momentum. Whether it's passed by April will remain to be seen, but indeed the first step in the process has been achieved, whereby the first reading has been achieved and the Select Committee has reported back. So 2 more readings, and once they occur the legislation will receive the royal assent and will come into force. So if the bill does pass, then there are some basic requirements that already exist under the Health and Safety and Employment Act which will continue, and they are around hazard management, so identification and control. So currently in terms of hazard management, Section 7 of the of the Health and Safety and Employment Act says that all employers must have effective methods for systematically identifying existing hazards, systematically identifying new hazards, and regularly assessing each hazard and determining whether it would become a significant hazard or is a significant hazard. That obligation will continue under the new bill. But it's not just employer, it falls within this concept of a PCBU, which I'll explain shortly. At present, under the Health and Safety and Employment Act, there is an obligation on each and every employer to undertake accident, incident and near-miss reporting. That will continue. There is an obligation on employers presently, which will shift to this new concept of a PCBU, a person controlling a business or an undertaking, to understand and train staff on, or workers I should say, on emergency procedures. There's a heightened obligation for staff training and supervision. There's further engagement going to be required with your employees. So presently, if you have 30 or fewer employees, you don't have to have an employee participation program for health and safety unless you've got a union that's expressly asked you to do so. The focus will shift under the new legislation to a very positive duty to engage your employees in the process. There are still obligations on contractors and visitors, but I'll explain those in more detail. There's still going to be the mandatory obligations in terms of keeping a workplace safe, thereby managing drug and alcohol issues in the workplace. And there's going to be a whole raft of new safety standards and recommendations. And the approach under the bill is 3-layered. The first is by implementing this new Crown agency of WorkSafe, and that obviously has been implemented now, and there are significantly more inspectors that have been employed. Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong, we've gone from sort of 150 to 300. Yeah. At a company level, there's a new duty being introduced for directors. And don't be confused by the concept of director. It's actually officer, and it's a duty of due diligence, and that's a new and different duty, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then at the workplace levels, there is this concept of the PCBU. So that's a person controlling a business or an undertaking, and the PCBU is the one that is the primary duty holder. And we're moving away from this concept under the Health and Safety and Employment Act of taking all practicable steps, which is defined in Section 6 of that Act, to actually taking all steps reasonably practicable. Now, it sounds subtle, but it is significant. So what WorkSafe New Zealand have said is that for 2013 and 2014, their first priority is to focus on working smarter. So it's acknowledged that the Health and Safety and Employment Act was enacted, but really the supporting regulations weren't, nor was there supporting guidance for industry. So WorkSafe's priority is to implement a clearer regulatory regime, and to focus on businesses that are at high risk of acute, chronic or catastrophic harm, or where there is a history of risk. And they've identified that one of their target areas is agriculture. On the list also falls forestry, manufacturing, construction and importers and distributors. Just this morning there was a release from WorkSafe where Grab One has been prosecuted and fined in the district court for selling a bubble making machine. So they've imported and sold a bubble making machine that resulted in a woman being electrocuted. So the bubble machine was plugged in but not turned on. It gave the woman an electric shock that threw her backwards. And it was established that the machine itself didn't have appropriate earthing. The parts weren't properly isolated, and clearly it was unsafe. The reason why Grab One were prosecuted is because they whilst they took steps to have the machine tested, they didn't advise other purchasers of the machine that there was a fault, and they didn't withdraw it. Off the top of my head, and I only read it just before we got on the plane, the fine was $15,000.
40,000.
40, was it?
Yeah.
40, yeah. So a classic example where importers and distributors can be held responsible now, but into the future that will continue to be the case when we talk about this definition of a PCBU. Certainly in Southland alone, that should say, in the last 5 weeks, there were 5 infringement notices issued in 2013, but in the last 5 weeks there were 15. And so WorkSafe have now got the resources and effectively the national mandate to take steps that they haven't previously done. Previously they would be involved with people and say, hey, you must do better. Now they're actually taking steps to tell people how serious their actions are by issuing infringement notices. And there's a recent example in Invercargill where there were 2 companies side by side. They were undertaking some roofing work, and they were inspected. And they were asked, okay, who's in charge? Where's your site safety assessment? Show us your identification of all of your hazards and demonstrate that safe practices are occurring. And on one instance, the foreman could provide the task analysis. They had proper scaffolding, they had guardrails, they had appropriately identified that employees could fall through a hole in the roof, that they had harnesses and they were being worn right next door. Harnesses provided, but they weren't being worn. The foreman had not undertaken appropriate site analysis or task analysis. There were no guardrails in place, and infringement notices were issued to the foreman in question, and there was an instant $3,000 infringement fee. And that's the maximum currently under the Health and Safety and Employment Act that can be issued for an infringement fee. Minimum is $100, maximum is $300. Further priorities for WorkSafe. As I said, assessors are going to be visiting workplaces and assessing compliance, and certainly I know a number of Melissa's clients have had visits, particularly around quad bikes and wearing of helmets. We've got a number of clients. Queenstown has been targeted recently by a number of assessors, and they're looking in with, the labour inspectors are also looking at compliance with the Employment Relations Act and as well as immigration. There's also going to be lots more investigation into serious harm accidents, but certainly down south we can attest to the fact that we're involved in a couple of matters right now, both involving fatalities, and the inspections or the investigations are significantly delayed, at least by 2 weeks so far, likely to be longer, and that's because there is a major resourcing issue. So even though we've got a lot more WorkSafe inspectors, there's a major resourcing issue. We've been involved in an amputation in the last month, and an inspector was brought down from the North Island because there's just insufficient resources in the South Island to assist in the investigation of that amputation. There's going to be a linking with 111 calls for WorkSafe inspectors, so there is a collaboration between WorkSafe and ACC as well. And their intention is to try and halve their 4-month investigation timeframe. So far, not a lot of progress has been made in that regard from our observations, excuse me. They have this concept of the 3 E's: educate, engage and enforce. And the intention is that this has a 3-year cycle. So year 1, educate, year 2, engage, and then year 3 will start to enforce. So we'll give you a year to learn about it, a year to engage with industry groups, industry guidelines, understand what your obligations are, and then we're going to be checking on you. From WorkSafe's perspective, construction and agriculture have already had their 3 years, so they're in year 3. So, excuse me, WorkSafe's priority is now to start enforcing within agriculture and within construction. And there is this concept of the 30-day cycle. So previously, inspectors would come along and say, gosh, things aren't flash, look, I'll come back, make sure that when I do come back, you've fixed these difficulties, you've addressed and resolved the issues that I've identified. Oh, thank you. But now what they're saying is, we will come within 30 days, we will issue you with an infringement fee, and within 30 days, if you have not addressed and resolved the issues that we've identified, we're going to progress the matter to a prosecution in the district court. So I think what we're seeing here, and this is before the bill has been passed, the Pike River tragedy has really given the government a mandate to require WorkSafe to really implement some quite significant changes in their whole approach to health and safety in New Zealand. We're not making really any difference in terms of reducing the number of fatalities and diseases that are caused in workplaces, and so the government is demonstrating through WorkSafe that that's no longer acceptable, and that employers have to step up. Now, currently there is an obligation under the Health and Safety Employment Act for employees to take all practicable steps to ensure their own safety. And that obligation will carry through under the definition of worker under the new Health and Safety Reform Bill. And what that means, what it currently says in the bill, and of course remember it's only gone through its first reading, so there could be changes as a result of the select committee process. But what it means is that employees, or rather workers, must take reasonable care for their own health and safety. So it's this reasonable care concept rather than all practicable steps. They must take reasonable care to ensure that their own acts and omissions don't adversely affect the health or safety of somebody else. They must comply with all instructions from a PCBU, and they must cooperate with any reasonable policy and procedure framework from a PCBU. And I guess that's where Dairy NZ comes in, and that's assisting PCBUs to understand what their obligations are going to be. What's the difference between a PCBU, a worker and an officer? So, as I said in my introduction, the bill was introduced at the beginning of this year, actually on the 10th of March. The first reading was on the 13th, and the report back from the Select Committee did occur on the 13th of September, as far as I'm aware. If this bill is passed, it will replace both the Health and Safety and Employment Act and the Machinery Act, and it will significantly alter the health and safety landscape. And as I said, it introduces this new definition of PCBU, worker, and the workplace. Previously it was called a place of work, now we're talking about workplaces.